kids, as in 10% of them, and many adults. How we got here is the focus of this segment. Officially, it's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It can bring stigma, but recently it's become more accepted, as have the medicines to treat it. They are stimulants with names like Adderall, Ritalin, Vyvanse. In the early 2000s, they became so widespread that many high school and college students popped the pills as study aids, and they became more popular in the pandemic, sometimes leading to shortages. Here's a pharmacist who speaks in the podcast Backfired Attention Deficit.
I remember one incident, though, of a woman coming in, and she was looking for Vyvanse, and we said, I'm sorry, I can't get it. And she was just, what am I supposed to do? She literally said, I will get fired if I don't take this medication.
That is just one voice in the podcast. Again, it's called Backfired Attention Deficit. And we're joined now by the co-hosts, journalists Leanne Neyfakh and Ariel Paredes. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Good to have you. So this is a little personal for each of you. So Leanne, let me ask you, this perhaps was one reason you pursued this project in the first place. Tell me about your own use of a pill that's meant for ADHD.
So I took some caffeine pills my freshman year of college, probably the first step on the path to what became an unfortunate dependence on Adderall during my time in college. I always wanted more time, and Adderall seemed like a miracle. It just gave me the ability to read an entire book without stopping. Not that it made me read so much faster, but it made me able to sit there and stay up later and not get distracted quite as much.
Which goes to how widely used it was in college. Ariel, did you kind of witness the same thing? I gather you went to college a couple years after.
Yeah, Leon and I both went to college in the mid-2000s, and certainly by the time I was a freshman in 2010, stimulant use on campus was widespread and not a secret.
All right, well, let's play a little bit of audio about what the long story is about, to add to what you both just said.
We're telling the story of how ADHD became the defining diagnosis of our time, and how the drugs used to treat it have become part of daily life for millions.
It's a story about the promise of psychiatry to fix our brains.
I wonder if this is how everyone else feels.
Do people just function without it being painful all the time?
It's about the power of the pharmaceutical industry to shape how we and our doctors think about what's wrong with us and what's going to make us better.
All right, so by the title of your podcast, it's clear you both are raising the question of whether ADHD and the drugs that treat it have backfired. First, though, the long story. The drugs in question are stimulants. How far back do they go?
These drugs were first developed in the 1930s, and back then, researchers and doctors weren't exactly sure what they were good for. They have a huge range of effects, so they were used for everything from clearing nasal congestion to helping people lose weight. They were used as experimental treatments for alcoholism and depression because they have some mood-lifting effects. And it was kind of in this spirit of searching for the right problem to solve with amphetamines that a researcher in 1937 did an experiment to see if they could help kids who had behavior problems. And sort of counterintuitively, these drugs that are known so widely for their energizing effects actually seem to help certain kids calm down.
Leon, as you tell the story, there is a key person, Keith Connors. You describe him as the father of ADHD. We didn't have that term yet, but what did he do?
So Connors was interested in helping kids. I mean, he was someone who saw these, especially hyperactive boys. So he ran with the finding that Ariel mentioned from back in the 30s and did the work to prove that this was really effective. Connors, ended up playing a really pivotal role in terms of popularizing this idea that eventually became widely accepted, that amphetamine, specifically Ritalin at the beginning, was a way to calm kids down who were abnormally energetic or abnormally disruptive. Connors ended up, being kind of an evangelist, I would say, for the use of Ritalin, but also other drugs that were later developed.
Let me ask you this, Ariel, because you're telling in your story two key drugs that are characters in the story, Ritalin and Adderall, and how the reception is, in many cases, from parents who are like, well, this has changed my child. Let's listen to another stretch of your podcast.
When we started getting feedback from parents, that that was extraordinary. I mean, we would have people call up and say, "Thank you for giving me my child back."
How soon after launching Adderall did you start getting phone calls like that?
Immediately. I mean, we knew we had something immediately.
There were about 900,000 children in America with ADHD diagnoses. By 1998, a CDC study showed that number had grown to 3.6 million. Did all those kids really have ADHD?
And that is a central question throughout this story. But one of the key actors that you bring into the story is the pharmaceutical companies. Ariel, what did you learn about the influence, in some cases the hidden influence, of drug companies to push this conversation in the country forward?
In the 1980s, an organization called CHADD, which is still the main advocacy group for people with ADHD, emerged to try to reverse stigma around kids who were suffering with this disorder. But what a lot of people didn't know back in the 80s, and perhaps still don't know today, is that CHADD receives a tremendous amount of funding from pharmaceutical companies. The makers of Ritalin and the makers of Adderall have sent them millions and millions of dollars over the years. And it's in fact these advocacy groups and these pharmaceutical companies working in tandem that then, lobby the government. The incentives are in some ways very noble, and in some ways are sort of driven toward profit.
Well, I want to bring in one last ingredient propelling the American diagnoses and American prescriptions, and that is something about the American culture that we live in. Here's one last piece of tape from your podcast by a journalist you interviewed. Here it is.
To get to the heart of it, you're probably going to have to talk to historians, novelists, people who can reflect on the culture of the United States and what is driving so many people not just to embrace amphetamines, but to embrace the narrative that they are sick.
Leon, what is he saying here?
So this is a journalist named Ray Moynihan. He is basically, I think, referring to a shift in how we define normal. It's a really tough word to define because it's painful, I think, for a parent to be told that their child is in some way abnormal, even as it's a relief, perhaps, for some parents to be told, well, actually, there's a reason why your kid is like this, why they're dysfunctional, why something's not clicking with them.
In the end, you both go back to Keith Connors, this father of ADHD, who, to use the title of your podcast, says things backfired. How did he come to that?
Connors became aware of the fact that ADHD and the drugs that treat it were not just affecting the 2 to 3% of kids that he believed really had the disorder. This was something that had gotten way out of hand in terms of both the kids that were formally diagnosed with it, but also people like Leon and I who were, using Adderall freely in college. It was around this time that Keith Connors read a newspaper article in the New York Times about a college student who had started using ADHD medications to study and had a very bad reaction to this, which led him to eventually take his own life. And this really disturbed Keith Connors. The idea that not just one person would take his own life because of the medication that he had helped promote, but that in fact an entire generation of people was using these medications and using the label of ADHD in a way that was very different from what he intended. Connors really kind of reversed course on what he had spent his life doing. As journalists, Leon and I found this so fascinating that the very person who was most responsible for our understanding of what ADHD is and the fact that we all kind of accept that it's a thing that many people have and it's everywhere and it's kind of the diagnosis of our era, this same person sort of expressed that this legacy really disturbed him. And it was almost like a Dr. Frankenstein story.
Yeah, wow. We've been talking to journalists Leon Neyfakh and Ariel Pardes. They're the co-hosts of Backfired, Attention Deficit, an investigative podcast on Audible looking into the history, the evolution, the industry of ADHD and how it came to be.